Thank you, Marty, very much. I begin with poetry. It always surprises people that a person with a math background wants to start with something from literature. William Carlos Williams once said that it's difficult to find news in poetry, and yet men die miserably every day because of a lack of what is found there. It was Maya Angelou 20-plus years ago at a presidential inauguration, who said these words: "Lift up your eyes upon this day, breaking for you, give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it, this dream, into the palms of your hands, mold it into the image of your most public self, sculpt it into the shape of your most private need. Here on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face and say simply, very simply with hope, good morning. Good morning to Massachusetts. Good morning. Good morning. How many of you, give her a hand for the poetry, I am a strong believer that we in education must be inspired by the work that we do. And my essential point today is the way we think about ourselves as a society, as a state, as individuals, as educators, as campuses. The language that we use in talking about the work that we do, the way we interact with each other, the values that we hold will actually shape our destiny. It's interesting that when I talked with Commissioner Freeman, my good friend Richard, I thought about the fact that he's heading a state that's well known for education, and he is himself a national figure. Would you give Richard Freeman a hand? He is highly regarded, highly regarded. And Marty, I'm delighted to be with you here because his campus is going into our conference, and we're looking forward to kicking your butt. I want you to know that, all right? Now, if you know me, you know that my college friends would say, "Who are you, Freeman?" I'm the biggest nerd you can ever meet. If you come to a basketball game, I watch to see when my students are applauding, and then I applaud, all right? Because I really don't know the game, any of them, lacrosse, anything. I just want to be supportive of my students. In fact, I am typically called the mega nerd. We are a campus of nerds. We take great pride in that. It is a campus that has students from 150 countries, and we are known for both international and national diversity. We lead the country among predominantly white universities in sending African Americans on to complete MD PhDs. Give us a big hand for that. It's really... And so I want you to hear two quick stories. You know, I often say that Baltimore is the Upper South. The Upper South. One day we think like people in Philadelphia, the next day like people in Richmond. It's been that way since the Civil War, we know that. But I grew up in the Deep South, in Birmingham. And in the Deep South, we love stories. How many of you saw Dolly Parton's Steel Magnolias? Remember that movie, that great movie, right? I can tell you're old if you saw it too, right, by the way? Like me, right? You know, where you cry and everything. So here are the stories. The first one involves my mother, who grew up in a rural town in Alabama below Montgomery, a place called Wetumpka, with an Indian name. And at age 12, she was required to work, and she had a choice of working out in the hot cotton fields or going to work in a wealthy home, a wealthy white home. And she wanted to see how rich people lived. And there was one distinguishing characteristic of the home. They had books. They had a library at a time when there was no library in the late 20s and 30s for children of color. And the woman was kind enough to say, "When you finish your work, Maggie, you can go into the library and read." And mother would go in and begin, and the woman would then say, "Take the book home, bring it back when you finish." All of a sudden, my mother's friends became very upset with her because they would want her to come out and play and would say, "Maggie, come on outside. Why do you have your nose in that book?" And their anger pushed her to think about the growing difference between what she wanted to do and what they were doing. And here was the difference. Mother said the more she read, the better a reader she became. And the more proficient a reader she became, the more she enjoyed the experience. And the more she enjoyed reading, the more reading she did. And she began to put her own circumstances as a poor little girl of color in perspective. But most important, she began to dream about the possibilities. In contrast, she said, her girlfriends never read enough to become good at it. And she'd watch them reading painfully, using their lips, and then they'd push the book aside and say, that's not interesting. And she thought to herself, well, of course it's not interesting if you can't do it well. And she began to understand what a challenge we have, that in order for somebody to do something well, they have to have done it enough to become good at it. And how do you get somebody into that? And so she knew exactly what she wanted to do for the rest of her life, to become a teacher. And she always said, Freeman, there's nothing more noble than teaching. One of Mother's favorite authors was Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote during the Harlem Renaissance. And in the book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, the first paragraph says, ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing, until the watcher turns his head away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men, Mother would say, and women. And her point, Hurston's point, my mother's point, was this. Those of us who are fortunate to get an education are able to see, in the words of Langston Hughes, our dreams fulfilled. Every person in here has seen many dreams fulfilled. You're here today because you've got a good job, you've got a great education, and you're trying to help others to do the same. At the same time, Hurston and my mother were saying, but for those who are not fortunate to get that education, you see the dreams, again in the words of Langston Hughes, forever deferred. They never get to where they want to be. And the fundamental purpose of education is to help people to dream about the possibilities and then to help them acquire the skills and the values they need to reach their dreams. Now, interestingly enough, I grew up in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, and my parents would make me go and hear people speak, and I really wouldn't want to go, but you did what your parents said. And I remember in 1963, precisely 50 years ago, being in church in the middle of the week, not wanting to be there, and my parents would always placate me by giving me the two things I loved. I have always loved math. I get goosebumps doing math. The teacher would give us 10 problems. I would say, give us 10 more, teacher. And the whole class would go, shut up, Freeman, every day. And there was a designated kicker every day. I got kicked every day. It was like a badge of courage for me for mathematics, all right? They would also give me, though, the other thing I loved, and that was food. I loved to eat. So I had M&Ms in one hand and math problems in the other. M&Ms with peanuts, by the way. And I'm sitting in the back, and the guy says, if the children participate in this peaceful demonstration, all of America will understand that children really do know the difference between right and wrong and that they want a good education. And I looked up and I said, who is this guy? And of course, his name was Martin King, Reverend King. And I did go, and it was a terrible experience, and I spent a week in jail simply for marching peacefully and kneeling to pray and asking that we be allowed to go to better schools. And they threw us into the wagon and took us off to jail. And amazingly, the experience taught us that even we, the children, could have some influence over our own lives. That children, if empowered, can work to do the right thing. Now, the significance of that second story is that it was the first example of innovation that I really ever saw. Innovation meaning what? That you look in the mirror and you say, the way the world is not the way the world has to be. That even though I've always thought, I would go to schools where we'd have second-rate books that come from the white kids when they're finished, and places without the resources. Here was somebody saying that we could do something differently in such a way that we could change the way the world is. You know, of all the U.S. News and World Report, beauty, I call them beauty queen kind of things, right? The beauty contest, that's all they are. When you don't do well, you just say it's nothing. When you do well, you want to tell everybody about it, right? So we have been #1 up and coming for 5 years in a row. That means we're considered the most academically innovative campus in the country. Give us a big can for that beauty queen kind of thing. And the other rating that you'll appreciate, there's one that says an emphasis on high quality undergrad teaching. Now we've got doctoral programs, but we really focus on those undergraduates a lot. And the list, and I've given it to every legislator, the list, and they do it because the regular ratings rarely change. You always have places up here, the privates, as always for the universities, they don't change. I mean, people keep saying the most expensive are the best. This is the way we think in America. And what's interesting is, but they have a list of those that they consider the best in undergrad teaching. And this year, we're right between Yale and Duke in position number 6. That's a big deal. Give us a hand for that. Big deal. And you know what I say? You know, Americans tend to think that if you're rich, you're really smart. Have you noticed that? You know, it's just that they go to the most private and most expensive places. They get a wonderful education, and they're wonderful people. Now, don't miss my point. I have wonderful friends who are donors, and I love them all those rich people. You know, the definition of a good president is you know how to kiss butt with dignity. With dignity. In the legislature, I have no shame. Tell me, these lips have been all over. Let me tell you. Give me a hand, all over. I have no shame. For my students, I will do it, all right? So I am not talking about rich people here. Make that very clear. But what I am saying is that what I say to my students is you don't have to be rich to be brilliant. Give me a hand for that. You don't have to be rich to be brilliant. That's the American story, and that's the one that is so important. But the other message that is so important is because of that civil rights period, amazingly, within 2 years, we had the Civil Rights Bill, we had the Higher Education Bill in 1965, and all of a sudden, you saw so many people going to college. I was talking about this recently, and one of the wonderful heads of a school board in Georgia said, you know, I want to say something. He said, everybody sees me, I'm a middle class. He said, actually, a rich white guy with a CEO of a company, and I'm the head of the school board in this city. He said, but what people don't know is that I grew up in a shareholding situation. My dad had died. My mama was a sharecropper. He said, but she saw the little Negro children getting ready to go to college, and she said, I want my kids to go to college too. And because she had been inspired by what she saw from what Dr. King had done for those little black children, she realized this was for all Americans, and she began to aspire for her kids to go to college. And the first one went. I went, he said. And then I helped my sister go. And before we knew it, we'd gotten jobs, and we were able to move our mama out of that sharecropping situation. And he said, that transformed America. When you had a Higher Education Act that did that, what percent of people in America do you think in 1963 had a college degree? What would you think? Let me hear you guess. I heard 30. Anybody else? I heard 20. It was only 10%. Only 10% of Americans. What percent of whites? I heard 80 from somebody. You think a lot of white people, don't you? You really do, right? Humor is always good, folks. It's always good, right? What percent of whites? Anybody else? 95. Good Lord. Wait a minute. No. It was only 11%. Only 11%. What percent of blacks? Tell the truth. Come on, tell me what you think. 2. It was 2%. All right. We were not counting other groups. But the point was, you didn't have to have a college degree to get a decent job. In Baltimore, Bethlehem Steel, you had manufacturing jobs, and people could take care of their families, right? What percent of Americans today have a college degree, 4-year degree? I heard 25. Anybody else? I heard 60. Anybody else? It is, overall, we just got to 30% for 4-year degrees. What percent of whites? 80 again. He's still saying it. Wait a minute. You have unrelenting loyalty, boy. God, I wish you were part of my group. It's only 37%. And for blacks, what do you think? It's up to almost 20. What about the fastest growing group, which is Hispanic? What percent? Not quite 15%. Not quite 15%. Now, here we go. What percent of Asian Americans? I better hear somebody. Usually people say 90, but 80, no. It's actually 50-some%. Because many of the people, like on my campus, we have 20% of Asian descent. Many are the sons and daughters of people who came to grad school and stayed. Chinese, Indian, and whatever, okay? One final question for the international perspective. How many of you believe that there are many more brilliant children in India and China than there are in America? I see some people laughing, other people looking uncomfortable. They said, oh my God, he didn't say that. Oh no, he didn't go there. No, he didn't. That is so politically incorrect. Oh my God, how does he remain a president? Oh my God. It is not a politically incorrect question, folks. It's a mathematical question. There are 1.3 billion Chinese, 1.1 billion Indians. You put the two together, you got 2.4 billion people. Now, 10% of any population would be extraordinary. Okay, Massachusetts, what is 10% of 2.4 billion? Don't you let me leave here, Richard Freeman, saying they don't know a bit of math. Wait a minute. What's 10% of 2.4 billion? 240 million. Somebody saved you. Yeah, thank you. 240 million. How many Americans are there in total? 310? So you almost have as many geniuses in those places as you have citizens. That's why if you go to anybody's grad program, at the highest levels, you're going to see large numbers of Chinese and Indians in computer science and other areas. You add to that the hungriest people in America have often been immigrants. Throughout the 20th century, large percentages of all the Nobel laureates actually had parents from European countries who didn't speak English well. They grew up in New York, they went to City College, the poor man's Harvard, or Brooklyn College, and they went on and got the Nobel Prize. Why? That hunger for the knowledge. Absolute hunger for the knowledge, that belief that it's the greatest place to be in the world, America. And so put the context there. What I'm telling you is that you've got all these really very highly achieving people, and we are a small country. What we have is creativity. That is what we have that is so important. And it's that creativity we have to use as we think about how we help more of our people become educated. The most recent study that came out last week on adult literacy, 16 to 65, looking at quantitative skills and your literacy skills, said that Americans over 55 were the most educated in the world. But every generation after that, we began to have a challenge. And when you get to the lower levels, we have a real challenge. Now, how many of you in this room are over 35 years old? I've got good news and bad. Which one you want first? The bad news is you're getting old. Get over it. It's okay. It beats the alternative, I can say that. But the good news is you are the second best educated in the world. Only Norway just for 4-year degrees. Literally, you are really. Now, anybody between 25 and 34? Got a few. Y'all got to bring more young people in this room, by the way. Wait a minute. Let me see your hand. Raise your hands, too. They proud to say it, too. Look at them. Oh, they so proud. So, I'm not 35 yet. I got good news and bad. Which one you want first? Bad news, you're not as smart as we are. But the good news is we are jealous as hell because we wish we were your age. So to believe me, we would take the youth in a heartbeat and be a little less smart. We would. Why do I tell you that? It's that we are not making progress. Now, in Massachusetts and Maryland are very similar. Both are, by American standards, in many ways well-educated, but that's because of public and private higher education. It's because of the percent of those who are older who have degrees. In our area, the national institutes of all types. In your area, you got a lot of people here. The big challenge that we face is that if we go with the aggregate data, it looks like, oh, we're at the top in some ways, in one way or the other. But what your commissioner and what all of you are saying is that, no, but let's look at the real data. 2/3 of your high school graduates come to public institutions. When you look at younger people, what we see is that they are not doing as well, that they cannot read well, that the reason you've got your vision project is that you understand you need to have more in college. You've got to find ways to have more of them completing degrees, that you need to look at the learning outcomes, and you're working on assessment to see ways that you can use in the LEAP data and that framework from AAC and you, that you have thought a lot about what critical thinking skills should mean and how you go about evaluating it, that it's not just about standardized tests. There are other ways of assessing without talking so much about accountability, but ways that will allow you to protect yourselves when people say, what do your students know? That you understand there must be connections between the workforce and what you do, that you want to help people to be able to get jobs, that civic engagement and preparing to be citizens is critical. Your state has done a great job of making that a priority, and you're focused on that. And quite frankly, that you've got to do more to look at research and economic development. And today, closing the achievement gap, because there is the big issue that you face. That you face, that Maryland faces, even with all of it, without getting great ratings at the K-12 level and having some fine public institutions. Fact is, when you look at our younger populations, they are not doing as well. And those who are from first-generation families, how many of you in this audience are either the first in your family or first generation to go to college? Raise your hands. It's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful story. I tell people, tell your story, because the big challenge we face today, unlike 30 years ago, is that amazingly, large numbers of people today who are the first to go to college are not succeeding. They may get into college, but they're not graduating. And one of the issues is many have to start with either remedial math or with remedial English. I saw where you got maybe a third or more having to start at that level. And the probability of somebody who starts in those remedial courses right now graduating with a 4-year degree is as low as well below 0.2. And so it seems to me that our challenge is to think about what we did when we were first in our families to go, or first generation, and how our institutions can think differently about what can be done to make the differences. And what I want to do is to talk about some of the examples on our campus that I think there's some lessons. And there's several important themes here. Number one, the question I ask every campus is, do you know your students? Do you know your students with some level of specificity? It's not enough to say, well, we've got 5 or 10% Hispanic, or we've got 10% black. The question is, so what are the backgrounds of those students? One of the things that students of color will tell you is, don't make judgments about me without knowing me. You don't know what the background of that child or that person is, quite frankly. Whether or not that person comes from folks who are supportive, whether the environment is one where they've been working to build up the skills. The question is, do you know the strengths of the student? What we have found is that in all the programs that we have on our campus for people who may have had some challenges, it is so important to have a strengths-based model. It's not enough to say students are at risk, because that makes them seem, you've got, I mean, quite frankly, in a lot of wonderful independent settings, people are the scholarship kids and people look down on them sometimes. Oh, those are the scholarship kids. Oh, that you want to make people feel really special. I was at a very prestigious university, and some kids were from public schools, and their friends who were there were from the best of boarding schools. And the kids from the boarding schools, understandably, very proud to say that they went to the school where their grandfather went. That's all wonderful. Remember, those are my donors, so I'm very nice to them, all right? But the kids from the public schools in New York were kind of embarrassed to say it. And I said this, it shocked people. I said, you came from so-and-so, and you're here, you must be really good and smart and strong, because you didn't have a granddaddy to help you get in. You made it on your own. Give me a hand for that idea of having kids feel good about who they are. We must find ways of helping kids who don't have generations of wealth to know they are American kids, human beings who can do anything. And so giving yourself a chance to know the backgrounds of the kids, and then to be able, quite frankly, to help those young people, or not so young, feel good about that experience. I remember years ago, before I got to UMBC, which is a place with a lot of very high-achieving kids, I was at an inner-city college, and as a dean and then a provost, and what was interesting about that experience as academic VP was that I started looking at, with specificity, at the students who were succeeding. And one group that just amazed me was returning women. I looked at this group. They'd come out of community colleges. They'd come to us, and I started studying them, and I learned the importance of focus groups. And I learned the importance of not only for me to have a chance to hear their stories, but to get my colleagues to sit and have conversations with students. Because it's so easy to look at somebody and just assume you know their situation. But to hear the stories of the students. There's a part of the theme I want you to think about. Do you know the stories of your students? Because stories not only inspire, they inform. They help us think through how best to help those students. And what became clear was this. When you've got a returning student who's there not only for herself or himself, but because of a family, because of a child or more than one child, I don't care if they can't read. They will learn to read. They will do whatever it takes to help their kids. And there's a message there that I saw that was helpful, that could help me with my 17-year-olds who might not have that same level of motivation, who were there just because their mom told them to get to college, to get to school, right? And so the question is, how do you use the strengths of different kinds of students to support each other and to hear their stories? Secondly, the importance of the use of technology. We have found it very helpful in all of our programs to do the data analysis, to do what we call analytics, to look at trends. Institutions of higher education often have cultures that focus on anecdotal information. We all want to talk about our best kids and what happened to them, and that's true, and that's great. But the question is, what about the typical student or the students who didn't succeed? If someone said, why did that bottom 40 or 50% not make it? Can we give them, with some specificity, in an analytical way, the trends among those students to know what happened? Some of your success stories with your project involves early warning signals, involves special kinds of sessions that you had when kids were not doing well in the calculus class, for example. For us, we now have something. We have an academic innovation fund that allows faculty to propose creative, out-of-the-box, almost kooky approaches to strengthening teaching and learning. I love what you're doing with assessment. And so one of them is a math gym. We have a math gym. And the gym has trainers in there. And the teacher can get the students can come to the gym. And the purpose is because the teacher will say, this person needs strengthening in these particular skills. And then the trainer will evaluate the skills to see whether the person is strong, where the person is not strong, and then propose some exercises. And the furniture is real kooky, so people are working on the floor. I mean, it's very out-of-the-box kind of thinking, but it's the same idea as when you go to a gym and you want to work on your biceps. The idea is, how do you focus on this and then have a test on that and then get back to that teacher? I mean, that's one of the proposals that we funded. Another proposal involved a Wisdom Institute for people who had retired, to bring them back and to see. We always say when people retire, look at all that experience that they have that's going out the door. So how do we bring these people back and have them teaching classes, but also teaching younger people things that could be helpful in terms of judgment and the way you approach the work? But the most important change for us, another theme, is that assessment is important. Assessment of student skills and looking at the LEAP data. But the big question, the really big question is, so how do we give faculty support in rethinking the teaching and learning process? This is very different from simply assessing what students are getting now. Why did we say that was important? Let me give you the results of our National Academy data. What we saw was this. We were trying to see why there were so few blacks and Hispanics who were succeeding in science. I mean, under 1% of the scientists at NIH are black, for example. Only 2% are Hispanic. But if you look at the health disparities in this country, you're talking about billions of dollars of problems, where Hispanic women and minority women have a much greater chance of having diabetes by the time they're 55. If there's nobody from those populations who are involved in the work and the research, why would we think somebody's going to finally solve that problem? And yet we're spending billions of dollars. And so the point was, how could we get more people of color into science and people from first-generation college backgrounds and low-income backgrounds? Well, it came out that it was surprising that only 20% of blacks and Hispanics who began with a major in science and engineering were literally graduating with a bachelor's in science and engineering. But what percent of white Americans do you think who start with a major in science and engineering, either at a 2-year place or a 4-year place, will actually graduate with a degree in that area? What do you think? I heard 45, somebody else? 35? 60? Right? The answer is only 32%. It was stunning to us that only 32% of white Americans who begin with a major in science and engineering graduate in that area. Now, let me give you another finding that is even more transformative in our thinking. And this is going to sound counterintuitive. The higher the test scores, SATs, the larger the number of AP credits, the more prestigious the university the person attends, the greater the probability that the student who begins in pre-med or science or engineering will leave it within the first year or two. Let me say that again, because every place wants to brag, oh, we sent them to whatever place. The question is then, what happened when they got there? My line is, all those pre-med and engineering majors become great lawyers all the time. My lawyers want to kick me every time I say that, but it really is true. Either that, but the higher the SATs, the higher the number of AP credits, the more prestigious the university, the greater the probability that large numbers of those students, except for the genius level one, is going to leave it. Going to leave. And why is that significant? Only 6% of Americans at age 24 have degrees in STEM. 6%. In Europe, it's twice that. India is in the process of creating 800 additional universities. 800. 100 additional universities. And the countries that have the strongest STEM infrastructure will rule the day. There's no doubt about that. We know that the GDP is heavily, somewhere between 50 and 80% of the GDP is directly connected to the science and technology infrastructure, depending on what we're doing in the country, whether it's war or whatever the period. And every time the GDP goes up 1%, you have another 1 million jobs. So any part of the country that is really doing well will see a strong science and tech infrastructure. At the same time that many of our students who come to this country, our Indian kids, for example, will be going back to their countries. My students in math and stat and computer can go back to India, work in Mumbai, and work for IBM there. So the question is, how do we have more students, not just blacks and Hispanics, but by the way, only 42% of Asian Americans who start in science and engineering. So the question I would ask you is this: do you know the probability of a student from a first-generation background, or somebody who is Hispanic, or somebody who is Asian even, what's the probability of their starting in chemistry on your campus for the 2-year program or for the 4-year and actually succeeding? Most places need to go and do the analysis. They've not done the work. And what you're going to see is, I'm telling you, I don't care how good your place is, you're not where you want to be. And it was because we saw on our own campus that typically we tend to say, well, if a student gets a C in chemistry, that's about average for a research university. That's what we all think. But here's the problem. If students get C's in the first level of work, they're not going to get A's and B's in the next level of work. For those of you who are not in math, think of it this way. Imagine somebody expecting you to excel in longhand division if you never learn to multiply, longhand multiplication and subtraction well. One thing builds on another. You get my point? And so every catalog in here says if you get a D, you retake the course in your major. But a C, you're supposed to keep going. Go and do the analysis of students who get C's. I guarantee you on every campus in here, 80+% will not make it in that major. So getting that C is almost, with few exceptions, a statement the person's not going to make it in this major. We've got the highest percent who actually make it, and so now almost half of our students graduate in science and engineering. Give us a big hand for that. It's a big deal, big deal. And that is not to take away from the importance of the arts, humanities, and social sciences. The point is we need broadly educated people and more people with all these backgrounds. You know, the course redesign that the University System of Maryland, which it is involved in right now, is focused not only on STEM, but on the humanities, the social sciences, and it's giving faculty the time and the funding to rethink the approach to get away from simply the lecture approach. How many of you in this room know that a lot of the students on your campus are bored sitting in class? Tell the truth, let me see. Bored, all right? And this is the most fascinating part. The neuroscience research for years has told us people can't listen for more than about 20 minutes. One of the reasons I keep asking you questions is to keep you from going to sleep and thinking about lunchtime. Wait a minute. You know, but the key is that we've moved to flipping classes. The Chemistry Discovery Center has groups of kids working. Everybody has a role, a blogger, a provocateur. It's amazing, and they change these roles. We use we have actual problems from the companies on our campus. We have 100 companies, biotech companies, IT companies on our campus, created by our faculty and by Hopkins faculty, students working in those companies, so the workforce alignment. But most important, we've got students in hands-on experiences. I would argue that the institutions of the future will be using technology creatively and the hands-on, face-to-face approach for blended learning in such a way that we rethink the instruction process, not just the assessment of skills, but that we look in the mirror at ourselves and we say, we can be even better than this. We can do much more. You know, folks, there are two kinds of people in the world. There are people who can suck every ounce of energy out of your body because they're so negative. You know who they are on your campus, don't you? Some of y'all in this room right now, you know who you are. I saw you looking at your friend right there. But then there are other people who can elevate people. You know, and you say, wow, that was really inspiring. Our challenge, when you think about our students and our colleagues, is to find ways to be inspired by the work that we do. At the end of my mother's life, my wife had convinced her to come to Baltimore. She didn't want to leave her church, and we convinced her we've got churches in Baltimore. And she finally came up, and this brilliant woman who could quote Emily Dickinson, tell the truth, but tell it slant. All of a sudden, we realized she had developed dementia. You don't want to see your mother going downhill. And I said to her one morning, I said, how you doing? And we were sitting on the porch. She said, you know, I know the end is near. You don't want to hear that from a parent. And interestingly enough, I also knew she had been hiding from me the fact she didn't know who I was. I'm an only child. But she was so smart. Even with dementia, she had a way, she would have me say a line of the poem, I would say a line, she'd say a line. She was trying to keep that memory going. She constantly was working on that, and yet she did not. She knew I was familiar. And I said, well, what's important to you now? She said, what's important? She said, relationships. By this point, I'm about to lose it. I'm trying hard to keep it together for her. And she said, you'll be okay. She said, my relationship with God. She said, hold on to your faith. You're going to be just fine. And then she said, my relationship with my husband. He's a wonderful man. She'd forgotten Daddy had died 20 years before. And then she shocked me. She looked me right in my face and she said, you know, I have a son. And oh my God, I'm thinking she's about to tell me she got a brother. I got a brother. And all of a sudden, my grief turns to a lot of anger. And in the words of my students, I'm thinking, TMI, too much information. If you have not dropped this bomb on me before, now don't you drop this bomb on me and die and leave me with this mess. I don't want a brother if I got, don't you do this to me. I'm looking evil. And she says, he's a college president. Thank God she was talking about me. Wait a minute. But then she really gave me the gift I give to you with the greatest sincerity. She said, teachers, I now understand, teachers touch eternity through their students. Whatever I had to give, my sense of right and wrong, my belief in those children, I will live through them. You know, I went back and spoke in Birmingham, and all these teachers came up and said, your mother didn't teach me to read, she taught me to love to read. And your mother came into the projects and told our grandmamas and our mamas, send your child to college. And because she did that, we could finally move our people out of the projects because one teacher believed in us. I challenge you, Massachusetts, to watch your thoughts. They become your words. Watch your words. They become your actions. Watch your actions. They become your habits. Watch your habits. They become your character. Watch your character. It becomes your destiny, dreams, and values. You are special, Massachusetts, and you can be even better. Thank you all. What a nice, very sweet. Oh, what a really, very nice.